I speak today not as a partisan, not as a pundit, but as someone who studies the long arcs of history to understand where we stand and where we may be heading. Throughout history, wars don't break out in a vacuum. They begin in the margins, sometimes in one region, then spread when systems fail to contain them. Today, a fire is smoldering in the Middle East. It is centered in Iran and Israel, but the United States is drawn in, and the risk of escalation is rising. This is not speculation. It is the result of strategic misalignment, miscalibrated power plays, and a world order under stress. Throughout history, human societies have been shaped by cycles that repeat themselves with remarkable consistency, even though the specifics change with time. One of the most enduring and consequential of these patterns is the cycle of conflict. Nations rise, grow strong, become complacent or overextended, encounter rivals, and eventually clash in ways that reshape the balance of power. This has been true from the days of ancient empires through the world wars of the 20th century, and it remains true today. Understanding conflict in this cyclical framework means looking beyond headlines and seeing how underlying forces gradually build pressure until confrontation becomes likely, if not inevitable. The roots of conflict often lie in the simple reality that resources are finite while ambitions are infinite. As societies grow, they demand more security, wealth, and influence. When one nation's expansion collides with another's security concerns, tensions mount. These frictions don't usually explode overnight. They simmer over years, sometimes decades, as unresolved disputes pile up. Small skirmishes, sanctions, or proxy confrontations mark the early stages, but when the cycle is mature, those sparks can set off fires that engulf entire regions. The cycle typically begins with internal growth. A rising power strengthens its economy, consolidates its institutions, and projects greater influence abroad. During this stage, the dominant global power may not perceive the challenger as an immediate threat, but history shows that this complacency rarely lasts. The established power eventually recognizes that the rising state seeks a place at the table, sometimes at its expense. At that point, competition intensifies. Trade restrictions, alliances, military buildups, and ideological battles begin to define the relationship. What was once cooperation becomes rivalry, and mistrust replaces dialogue. If the cycle is not interrupted, mistrust hardens into inevitability. Leaders start to see each other's moves not as isolated decisions, but as parts of a larger strategy to undermine them. This psychological shift is critical because once suspicion dominates, even defensive actions are interpreted as aggression. A missile defense system might be meant to protect, but the rival perceives it as a step toward a first strike capability. An economic sanction might be framed as punishment for a specific act, but it is understood as an attempt to weaken the regime itself. At this stage of the cycle, accidents or small miscalculations can have disproportionate consequences. The Middle East offers a vivid example of how these cycles play out in modern times. Long-standing religious, cultural, and territorial disputes intersect with broader geopolitical contests. Local tensions, such as those between Israel and Iran, are not contained to the region but draw in larger powers that have their own interests at stake. What appears to be a regional conflict is in fact a node in a larger cycle of shifting world order. The dominant global power, the United States, finds itself both protecting allies and deterring adversaries. Challenger, in this case Iran backed at times by other emerging powers, sees opportunities to test the resilience and commitment of the current order. The risk is that the conflict evolves beyond local disputes and becomes part of a larger, systemic confrontation between great powers. History shows that once conflicts reach a certain stage, they become extremely difficult to manage. The lead up to World War I illustrates this perfectly. A network of alliances, a buildup of arms, and a climate of mistrust meant that a single assassination in Sarajevo triggered a war that engulfed nearly every major power. Each participant believed they were acting defensively, protecting their rightful place, yet the system itself was primed for collapse. The cycle had matured, and the result was catastrophic. The same lessons can be drawn from the 1930s, when economic turmoil, rising authoritarian states, and the weaknesses of existing institutions made another world war nearly unavoidable. Again, the key was not a single event, but the accumulation of unresolved grievances and the convergence of long-term forces. Economic downturns fed nationalism, nationalism drove expansion, expansion provoked existing powers, and mistrust closed off avenues for compromise. The cycle came full circle in devastating fashion. Today, the global system shows many of the same stress points: rising debt burdens, internal political divisions, widening wealth gaps, and shifting technological advantages all create the conditions in which conflict cycles thrive. Add to this the weakening of international institutions that were designed to prevent war, and the parallels with earlier eras become harder to ignore. Regional confrontations, especially in places as combustible as the Middle East, risk acting as triggers that set off wider conflagrations. Breaking free from these cycles requires extraordinary foresight, cooperation, and humility, qualities that history suggests are rare in moments of great power rivalry. Leaders must be willing to see beyond immediate grievances and recognize the larger pattern at work. If they fail to do so, the system will continue its natural progression, and the outcome will resemble what it has always been when cycles mature: destructive conflict followed by painful rebuilding. By studying these historical arcs, it becomes clear that today's tensions are not random or unprecedented. They are the latest chapter in an old story. The challenge is whether humanity will once again repeat the cycle, or whether the recognition of these patterns can finally lead to different choices. Geopolitical flashpoints are the pressure points of the global system, the places where regional disputes carry the potential to escalate into conflicts with worldwide consequences. They are not random. They emerge where deep historical grievances, strategic interests, and shifting balances of power intersect. What makes them particularly dangerous is not only the intensity of the local rivalries, but also the way they pull in larger powers whose involvement transforms localized disputes into global confrontations. Today, the Iran-Israel-America triangle is one of the most dangerous of these flashpoints, not simply because of the animosities involved, but because of how it connects to broader struggles for influence in the Middle East and beyond. At the heart of the matter is Israel's need for security and Iran's determination to expand its influence across the region. Israel, a small nation surrounded historically by adversaries, sees existential threats in any move by Iran to increase its military or nuclear capacity. For Iran, the story is different. It views itself as a historic civilization and regional power seeking to reassert its role after decades of Western intervention and isolation. These conflicting narratives mean that both sides interpret the other's actions as direct threats to survival or sovereignty, leaving little room for compromise. The United States is pulled in not just as Israel's ally, but also as the guarantor of the current global order in the region. American involvement goes beyond defense commitments. It is tied to energy security, strategic bases, and the broader contest with other emerging powers who see the Middle East as a chessboard for influence. When Washington supports Israel militarily or imposes sanctions on Iran, it is not just intervening in a local dispute. It is signaling to the world that it intends to maintain dominance in a vital region. This amplifies tensions because Iran and its partners interpret these moves as part of a strategy to contain and weaken them, reinforcing their drive to resist. The volatility of such flashpoints lies in how easily missteps can escalate. A single drone strike, a miscalculated retaliation, or an intelligence failure can spiral into a conflict that neither side originally intended. In 2020, the killing of Qasem Soleimani, a key Iranian general, demonstrated how close the region can come to a wider war. While open confrontation was narrowly avoided, the episode highlighted how events in this flashpoint can rapidly reverberate across the globe. Oil markets spiked, alliances hardened, and military forces were put on high alert. The lesson is clear. In such tightly wound environments, even minor incidents carry outsized risks. What magnifies the danger further is the way these flashpoints connect to global rivalries. Iran has cultivated ties with powers like Russia and China, both of whom have their own stakes in challenging American influence. This makes any confrontation in the Middle East more than bilateral matter. It becomes a test of the global balance of power. When sanctions are imposed on Iran, for example, China may step in as a trading partner, undermining Western efforts and deepening geopolitical divides. Similarly, Russia's alignment with Iran in Syria shows how conflicts in one corner of the region can become arenas where larger powers test their strategies against each other. Israel's actions are also interpreted through this wider lens. Its security measures, whether defensive systems like the Iron Dome or preemptive strikes on Iranian-linked groups, are not seen in isolation. They are understood as extensions of American power and, by extension, the global order that has dominated since the mid-20th century. This perception fuels a cycle of resistance and retaliation, as Iran and its allies seek to demonstrate that the old order is no longer unchallenged. The broader context is the fragility of existing global institutions. The United Nations, designed to mediate and prevent conflicts, has often been paralyzed by great power rivalry, particularly in the Security Council. This paralysis leaves flashpoints like the Middle East without effective mechanisms for de-escalation. Regional organizations lack the influence to enforce peace, while external actors are often more interested in advancing their own agendas than in resolving disputes. As a result, the structural weakness of international governance adds another layer of instability. Geopolitical flashpoints are dangerous not just for what they are, but for what they symbolize. They are reminders that local disputes can no longer be confined within borders in a highly interconnected world. Markets react instantly to conflict in the Middle East, alliances shift, and global narratives are shaped by what happens on the ground there. The risk is not only a regional war, but also the unraveling of trust in the broader global order. If flashpoints spiral into larger confrontations, they can accelerate the decline of existing systems and hasten the emergence of new, often less stable arrangements. The cycle of history shows that such flashpoints have often been the triggers of larger wars. In 1914, the assassination in Sarajevo, a seemingly local event, set off a chain reaction that engulfed nearly every major power. The parallels are instructive. The Iran-Israel-America triangle may appear at first glance as a regional matter, but it is embedded in the broader story of shifting power, contested influence, and weakening institutions. That is why it must be understood not as an isolated conflict, but as a potential ignition point for far larger confrontations. The challenge lies in recognizing the disproportionate danger that flashpoints represent. They are small cracks in the global order that, if ignored or mishandled, can widen into chasms. Preventing that outcome requires not only diplomacy, but also a systemic understanding of how local disputes link into global rivalries. Without such an understanding, the world risks sleepwalking into conflicts whose origins seem local, but whose consequences are undeniably global. When analyzing the trajectory of nations and the likelihood of conflict, it is not enough to look at single events or isolated disputes. The real drivers lie in deeper structural forces that shape the world order over long periods of time. These forces operate much like gravity, often invisible in the moment but inescapable in their effects. Understanding them helps explain why certain moments in history lead to peace and prosperity while others spiral into tension and war. There are 5 of these major forces: the economy and debt cycle, internal order and disorder, external order and world power shifts, natural forces such as climate and disease, and technological innovation. Together, they create the environment in which all decisions are made and conflicts play out. The first is the economy and the long-term debt cycle. Societies expand when debt is used productively to finance growth, but over time, excessive borrowing creates vulnerabilities. Debt burdens increase, governments print money to cover deficits, and inflation undermines stability. Historically, when debt cycles reach their late stages, they tend to weaken nations internally and make them more aggressive externally. Leaders often turn to foreign policy crises as a way to distract from economic troubles at home or to secure resources needed to sustain their economies. This explains why financial strain so often precedes war. For example, the debt overhang in Europe after World War I contributed directly to the instability of the 1930s. Today, with record levels of global debt and rising deficits in major economies, the same dynamic is emerging, increasing the likelihood that economic stress will feed into geopolitical conflict. The second force is internal order, meaning the cohesion or fragmentation within a country. Nations that are internally strong, united in purpose, fair in opportunity, and stable in governance are better able to navigate external pressures. But when wealth gaps widen, political divisions deepen, and institutions lose credibility, internal disorder grows. This disorder weakens a country's ability to project power outward and makes it more vulnerable to external challenges. Moreover, leaders facing domestic unrest often look outward to rally support, creating conditions where foreign conflict becomes more appealing as a unifying distraction. Historical cycles show this clearly. When societies become divided, their ability to respond wisely to international crises diminishes and the risk of escalation rises. The current period of political polarization in many major powers illustrates how this force is once again at work. The third force is the external order, or the balance of power between nations. Every global order has its life cycle. It begins when one power establishes dominance after a major conflict, maintains stability for a period, and then eventually weakens as challengers rise. The post-World War Roman II order, led by the United States, is now showing signs of strain. Rising powers such as China and regional actors like Iran and Russia are testing the resilience of this system. When external orders weaken, alliances become less reliable, international institutions lose effectiveness, and rivalries intensify. This creates flashpoints around the world as ambitious challengers see opportunities to expand influence while dominant power struggles to maintain its position. The tension between maintaining the status quo and pursuing change becomes one of the central drivers of conflict. The fourth force is nature. Climate change, resource scarcity, and pandemics shape geopolitics as much as armies and economies. Resource shortages, whether water, food, or energy, often fuel instability and drive migration, creating stress within and between countries. Climate-related disruptions also exacerbate existing inequalities, which in turn increase domestic and international tension. Pandemics can weaken economies, destabilize governments, and alter global power dynamics, as seen recently. These natural forces are often underestimated in traditional geopolitical analysis, yet they create the conditions that magnify other pressures. A drought that reduces agricultural output or a storm that devastates infrastructure can destabilize already fragile regions and become the spark for wider unrest. The fifth force is technological change. Innovations in communication, energy, and warfare have repeatedly reshaped global orders. The Industrial Revolution shifted power to nations that mastered mechanized production. Nuclear weapons created a new form of deterrence. Today, advances in artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, biotechnology, and space capabilities are redefining what power means. Technology amplifies both opportunity and risk. It enables faster economic growth, but also creates new vulnerabilities. Cyber attacks, for example, allow smaller actors to disrupt much larger powers. The race for technological dominance is not just about prosperity. It is about survival in an era where the tools of conflict are rapidly evolving. These five forces rarely operate in isolation. They interact with one another, compounding their effects. Economic strain can worsen domestic divisions, which in turn weaken a country's ability to manage external rivalries. Climate shocks can deepen poverty, fueling political instability and radicalization. Technological disruption can reshape economies while simultaneously arming adversaries with new capabilities. The convergence of these forces is what makes certain historical moments especially dangerous. When several reach their late stages at once, the probability of large-scale conflict rises dramatically. The present global environment reflects precisely such a convergence. Debt burdens are historically high. Internal divisions are tearing at the fabric of many societies. The post-war global order is weakening. Climate pressures are growing, and rapid technological change is creating both breakthroughs and threats. Each of these forces alone would be challenging, but together they form a perfect storm that increases fragility across the world system. This is why local disputes now carry greater risks of escalation than they might in more stable times. To understand the likelihood of conflict today, one must see how these forces are interacting beneath the surface of daily headlines. Wars are not random eruptions of violence. They are the outcomes of systemic pressures building up over time. By recognizing these forces and the patterns they create, it becomes possible to see that what may appear as isolated tensions in one region are in fact symptoms of deeper global shifts. The lesson is that sustainable peace cannot be built on temporary fixes to local crises alone. It requires addressing the structural imbalances in these fundamental forces that shape the trajectory of nations and the fate of the world order. When discussing the future of global conflict, one of the most important distinctions to make is between probability and certainty. Nothing in geopolitics is guaranteed. Wars are not predestined events. They are outcomes of choices, missteps, and interactions between multiple forces. Yet while certainty is elusive, probability can be measured and assessed. This way of thinking does not claim to predict exact outcomes, but it does allow for realistic preparation. By framing the risks in terms of likelihood rather than inevitability, it becomes possible to grasp the seriousness of the moment without falling into fatalism. The probability of major conflict today is rising not because of a single incident, but because of the convergence of long-term forces and short-term triggers. Historically, the world has moved into periods where the chances of great wars rise sharply and those moments are often misunderstood at the time. In the early 1900s, before World War I, most Europeans assumed that a major war was unlikely, even though the underlying tensions were obvious. The assassination in Sarajevo looked to many like a regional tragedy, not the beginning of a global war. Similarly, in the 1930s, many believed that another world war was avoidable even as authoritarian states expanded and alliances fractured. In both cases, the probability of war was high, but certainty was not visible until after it had begun. Today, probabilities again suggest heightened danger when several structural pressures align: economic weakness, internal discord, external rivalries, technological disruption, and environmental stress. The chances of major conflict rise significantly. This does not mean that a world war is inevitable, but it does mean the odds of escalation are far greater than most people assume. In fact, when probabilities are examined closely, the likelihood of significant conflict between major powers can be placed at levels comparable to those that preceded earlier great wars. That is a sobering assessment, one that demands attention even from those who prefer optimism. Understanding conflict in terms of probability also helps explain why complacency is so dangerous. Human beings tend to underestimate risks that have not materialized in their lifetimes. A generation that has not experienced large-scale war often assumes it cannot happen again. The problem is that probabilities are not reduced by ignorance. A 30% or 40% chance of a global conflict may sound low, but in reality, those odds are alarmingly high given the stakes. People would not board an airplane if told it had a 1 in 3 chance of crashing, yet the world too often accepts comparable risks in matters of peace and security. Probability analysis also reveals how fragile systems become under stress. Even if leaders do not intend to start wars, accidents, miscalculations, and unintended escalations become more likely in tense environments. For example, when military forces from rival nations operate in close proximity, as they do in the Middle East, the South China Sea, and Eastern Europe, the probability of unintended clashes rises. Each close encounter between ships, drones, or aircraft may not lead to war on its own, but the odds compound over time. Eventually, a single incident may occur in the wrong place at the wrong moment, setting off a chain reaction that spirals out of control. Another aspect of probability is perception. Nations make decisions based on how they interpret risks, not necessarily on objective realities. A country that perceives itself as threatened may act preemptively, believing the probability of being attacked is high. Conversely, a country that underestimates its rival's resolve may miscalculate the probability of retaliation. These misperceptions create fertile ground for escalation. History is full of examples where leaders believed conflict could be managed, only to find that they had unleashed forces far beyond their control. Probability thinking reminds us that what matters is not only the objective chance of war, but also how each side calculates and reacts to those chances. The probabilistic view also clarifies why preparation is crucial. If something is certain, preparation may feel futile, but when something is probable, it creates space for strategic choices that can reduce risks. Building resilient alliances, strengthening international institutions, and improving crisis communication channels all reduce the probability of escalation. Similarly, addressing domestic instability, managing debt, and reducing economic inequality make societies less vulnerable to external shocks. These measures do not guarantee peace, but they lower the odds of catastrophic outcomes. In this sense, the focus should not be on predicting whether a world war will happen, but on understanding how to shift the probabilities. Leaders who approach geopolitics with humility recognize that they cannot control everything, but they can influence the environment in ways that make peace more likely. Conversely, arrogance, denial, and short-term thinking increase the odds of disaster. By thinking probabilistically, it becomes clear that choices made today on diplomacy, economics, climate, and technology have direct impacts on whether the future tilts toward peace or conflict. Ultimately, the distinction between probability and certainty is what allows for responsible navigation of turbulent times. Certainty blinds people into either complacency or despair. Complacency if they believe war will not come, despair if they believe it cannot be avoided. Probability opens a middle ground. It acknowledges danger without succumbing to inevitability. It pushes for preparation, resilience, and wisdom in leadership. And it reminds us that while history shows recurring patterns, outcomes are not fixed. The world is shaped by decisions, and those decisions matter most when probabilities are high. The challenge, then, is not to ask whether war is certain, but to recognize how probable it has become and to act accordingly. The future remains open, but only if those who hold power take the risks seriously enough to change the trajectory. Probability is not fate. It is a warning, a signal of how fragile the present moment is. Whether that warning is heeded will determine what comes next. In times of mounting uncertainty and escalating global risks, one of the most important tools for leadership is the ability to navigate through complexity using clear, timeless principles. When the world order is strained, when domestic divisions are widening, and when geopolitical rivalries are intensifying, short-term tactics or reactive decisions are rarely sufficient. What distinguishes sustainable leadership from reckless improvisation is the reliance on principles that guide choices consistently, even when circumstances are chaotic. These principles act as a compass in the storm, offering direction when events are moving too fast for calculations alone. Principles-based navigation begins with the recognition that the forces shaping the world are larger than any single leader or nation. Debt cycles, technological revolutions, shifting power balances, and environmental pressures are not problems that can be solved overnight. They must be managed over time. Leaders who try to manipulate these forces for short-term gain often make matters worse. By contrast, those who adopt a principled approach focus on resilience, long-term sustainability, and the understanding that today's actions have consequences that may not fully emerge for years. Principles provide consistency in judgment where instinct alone might lead to rash or contradictory decisions. One critical principle is radical open-mindedness. In an era of polarization and misinformation, the willingness to examine perspectives different from one's own is vital. Nations and leaders who cling to rigid dogmas close off the possibility of finding peaceful solutions. By engaging with alternative viewpoints, testing assumptions, and subjecting ideas to thoughtful disagreement, better decisions emerge. The most dangerous leaders in history were those who insulated themselves from dissent and surrounded themselves with echo chambers. In contrast, those who deliberately sought out contrary opinions were better equipped to avoid blind spots and costly mistakes. Another principle is the importance of transparency and trust. At both the domestic and international levels, mistrust is a primary driver of conflict. Nations misinterpret each other's actions, fearing the worst, and this cycle of suspicion feeds escalation. Transparency, whether in communication, agreements, or intentions, can reduce misunderstandings and lower the probability of miscalculations. The same holds true within societies. When governments are opaque, citizens lose faith in institutions, leading to disorder that weakens the state from within. Establishing transparency is not a guarantee of peace, but it is a principle that reduces the risk of spiraling into unnecessary conflict. The principle of system-level thinking is equally important. Often, leaders focus narrowly on immediate issues without appreciating how interconnected they are. An economic sanction intended to punish one state may destabilize entire markets. A military strike meant to deter aggression may trigger regional alliances and escalate beyond control. A climate policy postponed for convenience may lead to resource scarcity and political instability decades later. Thinking at the level of systems requires acknowledging that actions reverberate far beyond their initial intent. It means examining second and third order consequences, not just short-term gains. Leaders who ignore systemic interconnections inevitably create unintended outcomes that make the world more fragile. Humility is another guiding principle. History shows that civilizations rise and fall in cycles, and no nation is exempt from this reality. When powers assume they are invincible or entitled to permanent dominance, they tend to overextend themselves, ignoring warning signs until it is too late. Humility in leadership means recognizing limits, acknowledging mistakes, and being willing to adjust course when evidence demands it. A humble leader seeks advice, values expertise, and accepts that no one can fully control the tides of history. This humility does not weaken authority. It strengthens it by grounding decisions in reality rather than arrogance. Finally, there is the principle of balancing competition with cooperation. Rivalry between nations is inevitable, just as competition within societies is natural. But when rivalry is not balanced with cooperation on shared existential challenges, the system collapses. Issues such as climate change, pandemics, technological governance, and nuclear proliferation cannot be solved unilaterally. Principles-based navigation requires recognizing that even bitter rivals must find ways to collaborate on matters that threaten all of humanity. The Cold War offers examples of this, when competing superpowers still managed to cooperate on arms control, space exploration, and public health initiatives. That kind of cooperation is not only possible but necessary in today's world. The importance of principles becomes clearest when crises strike. In moments of panic, fear, and confusion, leaders without principles are pulled in every direction by immediate pressures. Their decisions become inconsistent, reactionary, and often self-defeating. By contrast, leaders anchored in principles have a foundation that steadies them. They may still face painful trade-offs, but their actions align with values and long-term objectives, giving coherence to their strategies and credibility. Their leadership principles-based navigation is not an abstract ideal, it is a practical necessity. The future of the global order will be determined not only by the forces that shape it, but by the choices made in response to those forces. If leaders continue to prioritize short-term gains, domestic popularity, or narrow self-interest, they will accelerate the cycles of conflict and instability. But if they adopt enduring principles, open-mindedness, transparency, systemic thinking, humility, and cooperative balance, they increase the chances of steering the world toward stability rather than chaos. Principles do not eliminate risk, but they tilt the probabilities toward peace and resilience. In a world where uncertainty is unavoidable and the stakes are higher than ever, principles are the only reliable guide. They do not promise easy solutions, but they offer the clarity needed to navigate complexity. Without them, nations drift aimlessly, buffeted by forces they cannot control. With them, there is at least the possibility of building a future that learns from the cycles of history rather than repeating their most destructive outcomes. In closing, remember, wars do not start with thunderous declarations. They begin in small, avoidable miscalculations. When you understand the long cycles that define our world, you see that what is happening now between Iran, Israel, and America could be the opening chapter of something far larger. But it need not be if leaders, and we act today with principled, systemic clarity, we may yet rewrite that opening. That is not wishful thinking. It's strategic possibility. Thank you.